glass, cold, and indifferent, but every so often, it whispers, beckoning the brave and the foolish alike to places better left forgotten. That's how we found Erithos. Or perhaps it found us. The signal came as a ghostly echo through the nebula's grace too, faint but persistent. It didn't belong to any known frequency, and its garbled, static-laden message was barely coherent. Help us. Erithos trapped shadows, Captain Darnell said, his voice unusually cautious as he played the recording for the fourth time. I don't think we should touch this one. He wasn't wrong. Every instinct I had screamed at me to steer clear. But the desperate tone of the message stirred something in me, an ache I couldn't ignore. Erithos, Dr. Vega, our medic mused, pulling up the ship's star charts. It's on the edge of the Perseus Arm, an old colony world, abandoned decades ago. What happened to it? I asked, though part of me already knew the answer. Classified, she replied, her voice low. No records, no logs. Just wiped from every database after the colony went dark. Then why is it broadcasting now? I asked, more to myself than anyone else. No one had an answer, but we all knew one thing. No one sends a distress signal after decades of silence unless they're desperate. Or something worse. The signal reached us while we were between assignments, skimming the void on the edge of the Perseus Arm. At first, it was little more than a faint buzz on the ship's comm systems, a background noise that seemed too insignificant to investigate. But then it grew louder, more distinct, a chilling static that resolved into fragmented words. Help us. Erithos trapped shadows. We listened to it in stunned silence, gathered around the comm station on the nebula's Grace 2. The voice was human or close enough to it, but something about its tone unsettled me. It wasn't just fear, it was desperation laced with something darker. Captain, Darnell said, turning to me, this isn't a good idea. He didn't need to elaborate. Darnell had been with me long enough to know when my instincts veered into dangerous territory. But the name Erithos stuck with me. I'd heard it before, buried in classified reports from my days as a soldier. A colony world, abandoned under circumstances no one wanted to discuss. This has to be a trick, Jenkins said, his nervous energy filling the room. A place like that doesn't send signals after all this time. No one's supposed to be there. Maybe someone survived, Vega countered, always the optimist. Or maybe it's bait, Jenkins shot back. I leaned forward, studying the waveform of the signal as it played on repeat. The patterns were erratic, but not random. Someone or something wanted to be heard. Set a course, I said finally. The room fell silent. You're serious? Darnell asked. I'm always serious, I replied. My tone leaving no room for argument as the nebula's Grace 2 approached Erithos. The first thing we noticed was a silence. Space around the planet was unusually still, as if even the stars had turned their backs on it. Erithos loomed large on the viewport, its surface obscured by dense, swirling clouds of ash and storm. The planet had a sickly hue, a mix of gray and green, that made it look diseased. Atmospheric scans coming in, Darnell said. Toxic storms, high radiation levels in some areas, and hold on, he frowned, tapping at the console. What is it? I asked. There's something beneath the surface, he said. Energy readings, weak but consistent, could be the source of the signal. Life signs? Vega asked. Darnell shook his head. Nothing definite, but with this interference, it's hard to tell. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the planet. Take us in. Land near the signal source. The descent to Erithos was rough. The storms buffeted the nebula's Grace 2, the ship's shields flaring against the acidic rain and high winds. Lightning crackled across the viewport, illuminating the desolate landscape below. This place is a graveyard, Jenkins muttered, staring at the ruins of a once thriving colony. The city below was a shattered husk, its buildings leaning at odd angles as if they'd been abandoned mid-collapse. Roads disappeared into pits of ash and rubble, and strange, spindly structures jutted from the ground like skeletal fingers. "Captain, I don't like this," Darnell said, his voice tight. "You're not supposed to," I replied, gripping the controls. The ship touched down in what had once been a public square, its cracked pavement now buried under layers of ash. The towering remains of a monument stood at its center, the figure atop it worn smooth by time and storms. "Suit up," I said, unstrapping myself. "We're going out." The airlock hissed open, and the storm's howl greeted us like a living thing. We stepped onto the surface, our boots sinking slightly into the ash. The oppressive atmosphere pressed down on us, even through the suits. The city was eerily intact. Buildings stood frozen in time, their windows shattered but their walls untouched. Signs of life, broken tools, scattered belongings, littered the streets as if the inhabitants had simply vanished. "Where is everyone?" Jenkins asked, his voice trembling slightly. "They've been gone a long time," Vega said, crouching to examine a rusted toy half buried in the ash. "But this doesn't make sense. There's no sign of collapse, no evidence of conflict, no bodies," I added. The thought hung heavy in the AI, or as we moved deeper into the ruins. We began to notice them. Symbols etched into the walls, the ground, even the remnants of vehicles. They weren't graffiti. These were deliberate, intricate designs glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. The shapes were angular yet organic, like the twisting branches of a tree or the veins of a leaf. "What the hell are these?" Darnell asked, running a gloved hand over one of the carvings. "Not human," Vega said, her voice low. "I've seen similar patterns in ancient ruins on Mars, but nothing this advanced." The symbols pulsed faintly as we passed, their light growing brighter the closer we got to the signal's source. IT started as a feeling, a weight in the air, pressing against us like an unseen hand. The deeper we went into the city, the harder it became to breathe, even with our suits filtering the air. "Captain," Jenkins said, his voice shaky, "I'm getting motion on the scanners. It's faint, but it's there." I checked my visor. Sure enough, faint blips appeared on the edges of the map, moving erratically through the ruins. "Could be wildlife," Vega suggested, though her tone lacked conviction. "Wildlife doesn't move like that," Darnell said. "Eyes open," I said. The blips grew more frequent as we approached the signal's source. Shadows seemed to flicker at the edges of our lights, vanishing as soon as we turned to face them. "Is it just me?" Jenkins whispered, "or is it getting darker?" It wasn't just him. The signal led us to a massive structure at the heart of the city. It was unlike anything else around it. Its walls smooth and black, its towering spire reaching into the storm. "Scans are going wild," Darnell said, staring at his console. "The energy readings are off the charts." The symbols on the structure pulsed in time with the signal, their light casting eerie patterns on the ash-covered ground. "This isn't human," Vega said, her voice trembling. "No kidding," Jenkins muttered. We approached the entrance, a massive archway flanked by statues that had been worn down to abstract shapes. "This is it," I said, staring into the darkness beyond. "This is what called us here." Darnell hesitated. "And what if it's the last thing we see?" I gripped my rifle tighter, stepping into the shadowed entrance. "Then we make sure it's not," I said. The interior of the structure was a labyrinth of smooth, black corridors illuminated only by the faint glow of the alien symbols etched into the walls. The light pulsed in rhythmic patterns, like the heartbeat of some sleeping giant. "This place feels alive," Vega said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not," Jenkins snapped, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his uncertainty. The comms crackled with faint static, and the signal grew louder, its words no longer just a garbled plea but something worse. Low, guttural whispers that filled the silence. "Join us to stay forever." "Captain, this isn't right," Darnell said, his eyes darting around the corridor. "We shouldn't be here." I know, I replied, gripping my rifle tightly. But we're not leaving until we find out what this is. We pressed on, the corridors growing narrower and colder. Frost formed on the walls, and the air seemed to hum with a low, ominous frequency. The whispers grew louder, overlapping in a chaotic cacophony that clawed at the edges of my mind. Focus, I barked, snapping the crew out of their daze. Eyes forward. We stick together. The corridor opened into a massive chamber, its ceiling disappearing into darkness. The floor was covered in a strange, black liquid that rippled with an unnatural motion. At the center of the room stood a towering monolith, its surface covered in the same glowing symbols that lined the walls. Is that it? Jenkins asked, his voice trembling. Looks like the source of the signal, Vega replied, scanning the monolith with her handheld analyzer. But it's emitting more than just energy. I'm picking up something else. What do you mean, something else? Darnell asked, his tone sharp. Brainwave patterns, she said, but they're not human. Before we could process her words, the liquid at our feet began to shift. Tendrils of black ooze rose from the ground, coiling and twisting like living shadows. Contact, I shouted, raising my rifle. The tendrils lashed out, moving faster than anything that size should. I fired, the plasma bolts tearing through one of them, but it reformed almost instantly. Fall back, I ordered, dragging Jenkins away from a tendril that had wrapped around his leg. The shadows retreated as suddenly as they had appeared, sinking back into the liquid as if testing our resolve. What the hell was that? Darnell demanded, his chest heaving. Whatever built this place didn't want visitors, I replied, staring at the monolith as we regrouped. The signal shifted. It no longer sounded like a plea for help. It was a command. Come closer, surrender your light. We need to leave, Vega said, her usual composure cracking. This place isn't just dangerous. It's hostile. We can't go back empty-handed, I said, my eyes fixed on the monolith. Empty-handed? Jenkins snapped. We've already got plenty. Psychic shadows, hostile ooze, and a death trap of a temple. Enough, I barked. We came here to find answers, and that's what we're going to do. Darnell, give me a full scan of this room. I want to know what we're dealing with. Darnell nodded reluctantly, his hands trembling as he worked. The energy readings are strongest near the base of the monolith, he said, but they're fluctuating, like it's feeding off something. Feeding off what? Vega asked. Us, he replied grimly, as we moved closer to the monolith. The symbols on its surface began to shift, rearranging themselves into patterns that seemed almost familiar. Is it reacting to us? Vega asked, her voice barely audible. Looks that way, I replied, my grip tightening on my rifle. A low rumble filled the chamber, and the floor beneath us began to tremble. The liquid rippled violently, and a new set of symbols lit up on the far wall, revealing a hidden passage. Looks like it wants us to go deeper, Darnell said, his face pale. We don't have a choice, I said, stepping toward the passage. Stay close. The corridor beyond was darker than anything I'd ever seen, its walls absorbing the light from our headlamps. The whispers followed us, growing louder with each step. Can anyone else feel that? Jenkins asked, his voice trembling. Feel what? I asked, glancing back at him. Like, something's watching us, he said. I didn't respond. He wasn't wrong. The passage opened into another chamber, this one smaller but even more unsettling. The walls were lined with mirrors, cracked and tarnished, yet somehow still reflective. As we entered, the whispers stopped, replaced by a low, pulsating hum that seemed to emanate from the mirrors themselves. Captain, Vega said, her voice shaking. I don't like this. Neither do I replied, scanning the room. The mirrors began to flicker, their surfaces rippling like water. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, but then I saw it, shapes moving behind the glass. Did anyone else see that? Darnell asked, his voice tight. Before anyone could answer, the shapes became clearer, dark, humanoid figures with glowing eyes. They moved closer, pressing against the surface of the mirrors as if trying to break through. "Back away," I said, my voice steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. The mirrors shattered, and the figures stepped out, their bodies made of the same black ooze as the tendrils we'd encountered earlier. "Open fire!" I shouted. The creatures moved with impossible speed, their limbs elongating and twisting as they lunged at us. Plasma bolts lit up the chamber, but the shadows reformed almost as quickly as we could destroy them. "Fall back," I ordered, covering Vega as she retreated toward the corridor. Jenkins screamed as one of the creatures grabbed him, its claws sinking into his armor. I fired, the shot severing its arm, but the damage was done. "Help me," he shouted, blood seeping from his wounds. Vega rushed to his side, dragging him toward the corridor as Darnell and I held the line. "Go," I shouted, firing until my rifle overheated. We retreated further into the depths of the structure, the shadows relentless in their pursuit. The whispers returned, louder and more invasive, echoing inside our minds. Given embraced the void. We stumbled into another chamber, this one dominated by a massive, pulsating orb suspended in midair. The symbols on its surface shifted constantly, and the air around it shimmered like a heat haze. "This has to be the source," Vega said, her voice trembling. "Then we destroy it," I said, raising my rifle. "Wait," she shouted. "We don't know what will happen if we do." "I don't care," I replied. "It's either this or we die here." As I prepared to fire, the orb flared with a blinding light, and the whispers reached a deafening crescendo. The shadows poured into the room, their forms coalescing into a massive, amorphous figure that towered over us. "This is bad," Darnell muttered, his hands shaking. "No kidding," I replied. The figure lunged, and the room erupted into chaos. The room erupted in chaos as the massive shadow creature lunged toward us. Its form was constantly shifting, black tendrils snaking out from its body like living whips. The air grew heavier with every pulse of the orb, the whispers screaming in our heads now, as if they were tearing through the fabric of reality itself. "Scatter," I shouted, pushing Vega out of the path of an incoming tendril. Plasma bolts filled the air, but every shot passed through the creature's body as if it were made of smoke. It reformed instantly, its glowing eyes fixed on us like twin suns in the dark. "This isn't working," Darnell yelled, firing blindly as he backpedaled toward a column for cover. "I can see that," I barked, my mind racing. The creature swung its massive tendrils, smashing into the floor and sending a shockwave through the chamber. Jenkins screamed as he was thrown across the room, slamming into a wall. Vega rushed to him, pulling him behind a fallen beam as he clutched his side in pain. "It's feeding off the orb," Vega shouted, pointing at the pulsating sphere suspended in the air. "We have to sever the connection." I gritted my teeth. The orb was the only thing in this hellish temple that seemed tangible, its shifting surface glowing brighter with every pulse. But it was high above us, protected by a barrier of black tendrils that lashed out at anything that came too close. "We need to get higher," I said, scanning the room. "Darnell, cover us." The chamber was massive, with walls lined by jagged, spiraling structures that looked almost like roots or veins. They twisted upward toward the ceiling, converging near the orb. "There," I said, pointing to one of the spiraling structures. "We climbed that." "You're insane," Jenkins wheezed, clutching his side. "I'll take insane over dead," I shouted back, firing a few bolts to distract the creature as it lunged toward Vega. Darnell and I provided cover as Vega hauled Jenkins toward the base of the structure. The climb was treacherous, the surface slick with some kind of viscous, black residue that clung to our gloves and boots. As we ascended, the creature turned its attention to us, its glowing eyes narrowing. "It's coming!" Vega shouted, her voice tight with fear. "Toss me the charges." I yelled to Darnell. He fumbled with the pack strapped to his back, throwing it to me just as a tendril slammed into the structure, shaking it violently. "Move!" I shouted, pulling Vega and Jenkins higher. As the creature lashed out again, we reached a ledge just beneath the orb, its pulsating light blinding up close. The whispers were deafening now, driving into my skull like nails. I planted the first charge on one of the vein-like structures connected to the orb, its surface hot to the touch. 3 more, I said, tossing a charge to Vega. She nodded, moving to the next connection point, while Darnell and Jenkins provided what little cover they could from below. The creature howled, its body surging upward like a tidal wave. Tendrils lashed out in all directions, smashing into the structure and sending shards of black material raining down. "Hurry up!" Darnell shouted, firing wildly to draw the creature's attention. The second and third charges were set, but the creature was closing in, its tendrils wrapped around the base of the structure, pulling it down as the orb's light grew more erratic. "Last one," I shouted, leaping to the final vein-like structure and slamming the charge into place. The orb pulsed violently, and the whisper stopped for a moment, replaced by an ear-splitting screech that shook the entire chamber. "Detonate!" Vega screamed. I hit the trigger. The explosion was blinding, a surge of white-hot energy that radiated out from the orb. The tendrils disintegrated, and the creature let out a deafening roar as its body began to unravel, collapsing into a swirling vortex of smoke and ash. The shock wave threw us from the structure, sending us tumbling to the floor below. My helmet cracked as I landed hard, the air knocked from my lungs. For a moment, everything was still. "Captain," Vega's voice cut through the ringing in my ears. She was crouched over me, her face pale and streaked with sweat. "I'm fine," I said, struggling to my feet. "What about the others?" "Jenkins is hurt but alive," she said. "Darnell's covering the exit." The chamber was collapsing around us, the walls crumbling as the light from the orb faded. "We have to go," Vega said, pulling me toward the exit. The corridors we had entered through were unrecognizable, twisted and shifting as the temple came apart. The glowing symbols on the walls flickered and died, plunging us into near total darkness. "Move, move," I shouted, dragging Jenkins along as Vega fired at the shadowy remnants of the creature still clawing at us. The structure groaned, massive chunks of debris falling from the ceiling. We sprinted through the crumbling corridors, the oppressive weight of the temple pressing down on us like a living thing. Almost there, Darnell shouted from ahead, his flashlight cutting through the dark. The exit was just ahead, but the shadows weren't finished. A final tendril surged toward us, massive and coiled with a desperate ferocity. I turned, firing my last plasma bolt into its core. The shot hit home, and the tendril disintegrated into ash. We burst out of the temple just as it collapsed behind us, a cloud of black smoke rising into the stormy sky. Back aboard the nebula's Grace 2, the silence was deafening. None of us spoke as the ship ascended, leaving the cursed surface of Erithos behind. In the medbay, Vega worked to stabilize Jenkins, while Darnell sat in stunned silence, staring at the floor. I retreated to the bridge, staring out at the void beyond. The whispers were gone, but their echo lingered in my mind, a gnawing sense of unease that refused to fade. "Captain," Vega said, joining me on the bridge, "there's something you need to see." She handed me a data pad, the readings from the orb before it was destroyed. The patterns were unmistakable, brainwave signatures, layered and intertwined. "It was alive," she said, her voice hollow. I nodded, the weight of her words settling over me. "And we killed it." "Maybe," she said. "Or maybe it wanted us to." I didn't respond. The stars outside the viewport felt colder, more distant than ever. "This is Captain John Rogers of the Nebula's Grace 2. Mission to Erithos. Concluded. We found the source of the signal, but it wasn't a distress call. It was a warning. Something ancient and unspeakable lived there, feeding off the remnants of a dead colony. We destroyed it, or at least, I think we did, but the shadows linger, and I can't shake the feeling that we've only just scratched the surface of what's out there. To anyone who hears this, if you find Arithos, stay away. Until next time, stay curious, and keep looking up